Hello and welcome to another video. My name is Laramie and today we are going to talk about why you should knit that sweater. In today's video, I am just going to kind of ramble a little bit about why I think it doesn't take a lot of skill to knit a sweater and why you shouldn't, I don't want to say waste your time, but spend a lot of time prepping to knit a sweater when you could just cast on and start knitting a sweater. Now, this idea came to my mind and I started thinking about this video when I had a conversation with a coworker who crochets primarily, but she also knits. And she happened to mention that she has always wanted to knit a sweater, but she never can finish the scarves that she's knitting, so she doesn't feel like she's ready to knit a sweater. And I feel like most people can relate to this. You start knitting small items, and then you start knitting a scarf or a lot of washcloths, things like that, until you feel ready to knit a sweater. And you feel like you need to have mastered the scarves and the hats, maybe even the gloves, before you move on to that like big body garment. But what happens often, or at least in the conversations I've had with people, is they spend so much time in that prepping zone where they're just trying to master all the skills and techniques needed to knit a sweater that they kind of get bored of it, or they fall away from it, or they just psych themselves out feeling like they can't knit a sweater. And I think the reason that I have a sweater and have finished a sweater and that I have continued knitting, and primarily continued knitting, is because I didn't spend so much time in the prepping part of my knitting journey and the learning how to knit, as opposed to just like diving into a project and allowing that learning to happen as I am actively knitting a sweater. And so I wanted to like show you some pattern recommendations and just talk a little bit about this, because I really think that if you are a new knitter or you have only knit like small hats or gloves or scarves, things like that, but you really want to knit a sweater, you are ready, even if you don't feel ready to knit a sweater. So there's really not a lot of structure to this video. I just wanted to pop in here and kind of ramble about it. But as a knitter, I actually only knitted a few things before I casted on my first sweater. At some point in February or March of last year, I picked up not knitting needles. If you've watched my first video, you know I picked up chopsticks and learned how to knit on a pair of chopsticks. I got about half of a scarf done, realized that I really liked knitting, invested in some actual knitting needles, knitted some washcloths, and then just decided to cast on my first sweater. And I still have that cast on here. I have not finished it because I do want to make some changes to it before I keep going. And I also not a huge fan of wearing acrylic. So I had like purchased this yarn from Goodwill. It was just acrylic yarn at Goodwill. And then I used Made in the Moment's free video pattern available on YouTube. It's just like a hour-long video, and a Made in the Moment Aspen teaches you how to knit this raglan seam sweater. And at this point, I knew two things about knitting. I mean, I knew more than that, let's be real. I knew how to cast on. I knew how to bind off. But primarily I knew how to purl and I knew how to knit, but that's it. Like I knew a knit stitch, I knew a purl stitch, and I had learned how to cast on and bind off. I had only learned one cast on method at the time. I was very new in my knitting. So it was probably in February at some point that I started knitting. And by March, I was casting on my first sweater. And by the end of March, maybe early April, I casted on the sweater that I have actually finished, which I'll show you here in a minute. But I basically started knitting a sweater, like an actual garment, without having any knowledge of how to knit a sweater. And when I started thinking about making this video, I got on Google and I just typed in like good beginner sweater knitting patterns, because what I was going to do, I was going to recommend some sweater knitting patterns for people who have never knitted a sweater before and just want to dive right in, but they're nervous, so maybe some free patterns, things like that. But what I found is even in the beginner knitting sweater patterns, a lot of people were still recommending that you had all of these skills, that you know how to do German short rows, that you know how to do increases and decreases in the various ways, that you know all of these different bind off and casting on methods. And I disagree. I disagree because I believe that if you know how to do a knit stitch, you know how to do a purl stitch, and you have just a very basic understanding of knitting, then you have everything you need to pick up a sweater pattern. And now I'm not saying like a specific sweater pattern or like all sweater patterns, but you have the skills you need to knit a sweater, because I knitted this sweater, and you can see it's a very wide neckline. I knitted this sweater and it's pretty much done. The only thing is I need to bind off the bottom, and then I want to change the sleeves because I don't like the way that I did the sleeves. But I knitted this entire sweater without having any of those skills when I started. I find that rather than trying to find other patterns to teach you those skills, like a hat with decreases and increases, like looking up how to do German short rows, learning all of that before you start, I think you just need to start knitting your first sweater. Even if you don't finish it, even if it is still a whip at the end of a year, I learned more about sweater knitting. I learned more about knitting in general and had the most amount of fun by going ahead and tackling those projects that I felt like I wasn't ready to tackle because I didn't know all of these things, but I had like this intrinsic desire and motivation to have those items or to work on those items. So they were way more accessible and like easy for me to convince myself to work through, even though I failed, even though I made mistakes. And so my advice to my coworker who I was chatting to about this was just knit the dang sweater. Like, give up on scarves. If you don't enjoy the scarf knitting process because it's just back and forth and you're doing the same thing over and over again and it's very slow compared to crochet, that was her complaint. I said, just stop knitting scarves. Don't knit scarves. If you want a knitted sweater, then pick up a pattern and try to knit it. And if you don't know a skill, the pattern, if it's a good pattern, will teach you how to do the skill, or at least it'll tell you the name, and then you can go on YouTube and find different skills related to that. And so in this second, part of this very unstructured video, I do want to tell you the patterns that I use to learn how to knit a sweater. And I have successfully completed one sweater, and I am like pretty much done with 2 other sweaters, and then I have just casted on an additional sweater. And some of these are geared towards beginners, but some of them are also just sweater patterns that I purchased on Ravelry because I liked the way they looked. This first pattern that I started with is a great pattern or a great project if you are not a pattern reader or you have no desire to read patterns. If you are very much like, I just want to watch a YouTube video, have the YouTube person tell me exactly what to do, tell me how to figure out my measurements, and I will just watch this video as I work on my sweater, then Made in the Moment Simple Top-Down Raglan, I will link the video below, is the sweater pattern for you. It is a sweater with long sleeves. I decided I wanted it short-sleeved. Then I changed my mind, so I'm going to rip these back at some point and redo them. But otherwise, I pretty much have a completed sweater, and I think that's the back. This is the front. You can tell because there's some jogs in my stripes here. So not only is the first sweater that I tried to knit, like I knitted it or started knitting it less than a month into knitting, I also did color blocking. Because why not really give yourself a challenge the first time you've ever knitted? At this point, I never even woven in an end. I didn't even know what weaving in ends was. I hadn't Googled what blocking was yet. I knew nothing when I started this sweater. And I have a nice squishy folded over neckline, right? Like this beautiful folded over neckline. These like fairly good looking stripes through here. And this was less than a month in of knitting. Right? And so this is a good one if you just like watching YouTube. Also, if you like Aspen from Made in the Moment, a great way to support them, right? And it's a free YouTube video. It's a free YouTube pattern. I don't know that there's a written pattern that goes with it, but they do a great job walking you through the steps on the video. The next sweater that I casted onto was the Step-by-Step sweater by Florence Miller. Florence Miller has videos for the Step-by-Step sweater. And then she also has a pattern PDF that is also free. And so I did both. I mostly looked off the paper pattern, but then I also referred to the videos as needed. And I will say, I learned through this process that I am actually more of a pattern reader than I am a YouTube video watcher when it comes to learning how to knit a pattern. I would rather have the directions printed out in front of me on paper than have somebody just tell me through a YouTube video. So I really like Made in the Moments video, but for my style of knitting, this was more helpful. So a couple of things to note about the Made in the Moment pattern. It is very straightforward. Like, it is incredibly simple. It's a rolled neckline. I believe it is 2x2 rib. And there is no short row shaping, meaning that the front and the back are reversible because the front sits exactly the same height as the back. Florence Miller's step-by-step sweater has short row shaping, which pulls the back of the sweater up higher so that it sits on the neck nicer. That is really the primary reason why I wanted to knit a different sweater, along with just like being ready and hungry to knit more sweaters, was I liked the idea of having a nice neckline that sat a little better on my neck than the way a non-shaped neckline sits. So if you want to learn short row shaping and you want to do it either with a written pattern or with a YouTube video, this is a great sweater. Again, this is Step by Step Sweater by Florence Miller. This is the pattern that I recommended my coworker because she loves YouTube videos. She likes to learn via YouTube, but she also wanted something that had that like clean neckline kind of thing. So this is the sweater pattern that I recommended. I cast this on probably also less than a month into knitting. I made a lot of mistakes. I made a lot of errors. I didn't even know how to add a new ball of yarn when I started knitting this sweater. Like there was a lot of things that I learned. But I will say, and I'll say this again probably, I had the most fun and learned the most working on projects like this. I found this way more satisfying, way more engaging, and way easier just to focus and learn from because I was knitting a sweater. Like there's just something about knitting, something that you really want to knit. You are just going to figure it out. You're going to make mistakes. You might have to rip back, but the process of figuring it out feels so much more digestible than if you are knitting just like hundreds of scarves, hoping that you will eventually like get one done and then you feel like you can knit a sweater. You could be one day into knitting as long as you know how to make a knit stitch and make a purl stitch. I'm convinced that you can work through a pattern like the step-by-step sweater. So that's the second pattern I casted on. Yarn choice is the reason I have not finished this, and I did not size it to myself correctly. But I was not done being hungry for knitting sweaters, so then I finally cast it on the Serene sweater by Kydre, which if you've spent any time on this channel, you have heard all about this sweater. This is the sweater that I finished. Again, this was incredibly easy. So even though I had done those already, I knew short row shaping, kind of, by the time I got here. This sweater was, again, such a great learning opportunity, but also not that hard. It's just stockinette stitch, the whole thing. The whole entire thing is stockinette stitch with increases and decreases. Increases through your raglan seam, decreases on your sleeves. There is short row shaping in the neckline, but it is very straightforward. She walks you through it really well, and that's it. And you don't need to know any of those things to knit this entire sweater. This is a DK weight sweater, so it takes a little bit of time to knit up, so keep that in mind. If you want that instant gratification, you're not going to get it with a DK weight pattern. But I am still confident with no skills at all that you could knit this sweater. It might take you months like it took me, probably will, and you'll have to learn some skills as you go. But I think that's the best way to learn, is just to dive into a project you really want to do and figure it out. And then be ready and prepared that if you make a mistake, you can just undo it. Or if you make it a mistake, you can knit it again. You can knit it in a different color. You could, if you get a whole white garment like me, and then you're like, well, if I stain it, I guess I'll just dye it a different color, right? Like, it's so forgiving, and it's so much more fun to me to knit the sweater. So last one, this is the last sweater that I have knitted. I decided at this point that I wanted to knit a rolled neckline. I had knit that other rolled neckline from the Made in the Moment sweater, but I wanted to knit a rolled neckline that was a little tighter, I'm not a big fan of a loose neckline, so I wanted to like be intentional about the kind of neckline that I chose. And so this sweater is the Grace sweater, and I believe it's by Adorable Knits, and I think her name is Dorothy, but I don't remember her last name. But I am knitting this sweater, and I've gotten a lot farther. And I'll talk more about this sweater when I do my next podcast episode. And I talked more about it in the last episode as well. But this is the Grace sweater. Even though I have now fully completed one sweater and technically knitted almost all of 3 sweaters, I still started this with a level of uncertainty. And the main part of the uncertainty was knitting a 1x1 rib and then doing a rolled neckline. And then I haven't done German short rows in over a year. And so I was a little nervous about, or almost a year, I was a little nervous about doing German short rows again because I didn't have them memorized. And so there's something to be said that even if you know the skill and even if you have the skills and you know how to do all of the things technically required in the pattern, you are still probably going to need the support of the pattern, especially as a new knitter, in order to get it right. So you could spend years mastering all of the skills needed to make a sweater and then still have to figure some things out as you move through the sweater pattern. So this is the Grace sweater. I'm in love with this sweater. You can hear I have one of those like counting stitch markers. That's what's like making all this jingly noise. But I just like all of this rant to say that if you want to knit a sweater, no matter what level you are at in your knitting, I think you have everything you need. As long as you have the desire to knit a sweater, I think that's all you need to successfully knit a sweater. And then, of course, the desire as you move through it to just figure it out as you go. And there's something else. I've always read that you should read a pattern in full before you begin it. But what I find is that if I'm not actively knitting a section of the pattern, I have no idea what the pattern is telling me. So if you are reading a pattern and it does not make sense to you and you haven't started knitting and you're just trying to read through the whole pattern, it's okay that it doesn't make sense to you. Because you may be like me, you have to actually be at that section of the knitting to understand what the pattern is asking of you. As long as you can understand how many stitches you need to cast on and what gauge you're supposed to be getting, and even then, like for your first sweater, it's okay if you don't make gauge. The sweater might not fit you, but at least you got to knit the sweater. But as long as you kind of understand that, you're going to be just fine. Like, as long as I understand the first direction on the pattern, I feel confident that I can knit the pattern. It's just making sure that I understand that first part, because generally, even knitting the Grace sweater, I tried to read all the instructions beforehand. And when just looking at the German short row instructions, I was confused because I wasn't actively knitting that part of the sweater, and so I could not visualize what I was supposed to be doing. But as soon as I got to that part of the sweater, I immediately was like, oh, I'm breaking my yarn and moving over. That's it. That's all that said. So, okay. That was just a quick rant about why I think you should just knit the sweater, regardless of whether or not you feel ready to knit it, as long as you want to knit it. So those of you who have knitted sweaters or have heard of really easy sweater patterns to knit, go ahead and leave them below. All the patterns that I talked about today are raglan sweaters, so they will be in the description box for those patterns and YouTube videos. But if you have non-raglan sweaters, like pieced together sweaters, bottom up sweaters, anything like that, or even raglan sweaters that you think may be beneficial for a new knitter to try to knit, please leave those below. Also, let me know if you have like this fear like my coworker has, where you feel like you need to finish like a scarf or several items before you're good enough to knit a sweater. And then let me know if I have convinced you to knit a sweater. All right, take care, and I will see you next week. Bye.